All right, I see Eric has joined. Hi, Eric.
Hi, Dineo.
How are you doing?
I'm well. I had a nap. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. I think let's get started. Those that stream in a bit later will probably catch the entail of the introduction. So welcome everyone to tonight's online presentation and a special warm welcome to our two co-presenters today, Ama Josephine Budge Johnstone and Eric Gyamfi. I am Dineo Diphofa and I work at VIAD, and I'll be moderating Ama and Eric's conversation this evening, which falls under our Intra-Actions series. It is the third iteration of a series of engagements initiated by the University of Johannesburg newly established Creative Microbiology Research Colab, which is also known as the CMRC. It is the first bioart creative research program and laboratory in Africa. And the lab itself is now completed, and its launch was celebrated with a seminal exhibition hosted at the Fada Gallery in July of this year. So you're welcome to visit our website for more information on that. Just to give you some context on the CMRC, it is a collaboration between VIAD, which is the Visual Identities in Art and Design Research Center, which is located in the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture, and the WHRC, which is the Water and Health Research Center located in the Faculty of Health Sciences here at UJ. And fundamentally, these are two very different research strands, one being in visual arts, while the other is in microbiology and water sanitation. So the CMRC is an interdisciplinary and interfaculty collaboration, which focuses on bioart and design, creative practices using living and non-living matter as media, and specializes in the intersection of art, design, and microbiology, using bacteria, mycelium, yeast, and slime mold as our primary organisms. Drawing from both visual art and microbiology allows for innovative, creative practices and processes to emerge through experimentation and play. These are different kinds of outputs, sensibilities, aesthetics, research protocols, as well as tools and technologies that inform this connection, or rather intra-connectedness, to use a term coined by Karen Barad. So this connection of these two disciplines come together to produce the kinds of amazing work and outputs that we see from a number of artists and scholars, Eric and Ama being two of them. As part of our Intra-Action series, newly appointed VIAD Research Associate, writer, artist, scholar, and pleasure activist, Ama Josephine Budge Johnstone, welcomes her longtime colleague and friend, Eric Gyamfi, a Ghanaian photographer, experimenting with the hybrid nature of analog, digital, and chemical processes. Together, Gyamfi and Johnstone invites us to share in the intimate explorations of ecological, chemical processes, Black queer erotics, interspecies futures, and the various ways the more than human contaminate, collaborate, and infect our work, and how we feel through those catalyzing processes. Ama is an associate lecturer at Central St. Martin's, an MFA tutor at the Sandberg Institute, and is currently in the final stages of her PhD at Birkbeck University. Ama's wider interdisciplinary work thinks through sustainable ecologies of care and more than survival for BIPOC women and queer folk in the arts and academia. Ama's writing was shortlisted for the 2023 Future World Prize. She has essays, short fiction, and art writing published internationally and has been exhibited across Europe. Ama's work has additionally been translated into Twi, French, German, and Swedish. Eric Gyamfi is a photographer living and working in Ghana and is currently pursuing an MFA at the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Ghana. He has shown work on ecologies and politics of the living at the Vienna Biennale in 2021, the 11th and 12th Bamako encounters in 2017 and 2019 respectively, as well as a solo exhibition this year called Fixing Shadows, Julius and I, at Autograph in London. So before we begin, I'd like to get some housekeeping out of the way. We will have presentations by both Eric and Ama, which will be about 10 to 15 minutes each. Eric and Ama will then converse for 20 minutes, and thereafter we will open the floor for questions and comments for an additional 15 minutes. So should you be interested in any programming that VIAD or the CMRC still has lined up for the remainder of the year, please leave your email addresses in the chat and we'll make sure to add it to our mailing list. Over to you, Ama.
Thank you so much, Dineo. I'm super thrilled to be here. It's really, really exciting to kind of make this position official with VIAD, who I've been kind of aware of and in dialogue with for, 5 years maybe now. So it's really nice to kind of be moving into this new relationship, and it feels very perfect to be beginning this part of this kind of chapter of this story in conversation with Eric. As you said so beautifully, Eric and I have been kind of engaged in a ongoing long distance intellectual love affair for a long time. And his work continues to, deeply challenge and inform my practice. So I'm really excited to be doing this together. I'm wondering if you want to either make me a host or a co-host rather, or maybe spotlight Eric and I in the Zoom. That might be super cute. And yeah, I don't know, Eric, do you want to say something before we kind of like go in, or should I just like dive in? What do you feel?
Just to say that it's a complete honor to be seated at the table with you, thinking out loud like we usually do with an audience, to hear and participate in our thoughts. And I appreciate that you would ask me, and I appreciate the VIAD for creating the space for this to happen. So I'm just feeling grateful.
I love that. Thank you so much. Yeah, 100%. I think I've been really kind of increasingly trying to do, when I get asked to do a talk, to kind of bring people who I'm already having these kind of conversations with, and to kind of have these conversations, as you say, kind of out loud in public. I think there's something really, really urgent at this particular moment, socio-political moment, about making visible this kind of like soft power, soft labor, like, and also this kind of process driven, like I want to say like fumbling through, like a tender fumbling through ideas, like I think there's such an emphasis now on this kind of presenting this like highly polished Black excellence, right? And it's also to do with respectability politics and assimilation and the current kind of Black art renaissance that's happening. And I feel like I just keep wanting to push back against that and be like, well, here are the ways that I'm figuring through a kind of slow form of failure that's nevertheless like generative and beautiful and nourishing and necessary. So I'm really kind of wanting to make visible these kind of mycelial underground roots. Okay, so we agreed that we're both going to share something that kind of speaks to this theme. I immediately, when Dineo and Brenton asked me for a title, I was like, you're going to call it an infectious feeling. I was straight in. Partly because I've been thinking a lot about this idea. Obviously, I think we've been globally thinking a lot about this idea of infection and who is infectious and contamination, but also because in my thinking, I've kind of been doing this kind of deeper, older thinking about contamination in terms of the contaminants of climate colonialism, be they literal material contaminants such as microplastics, or high quantities of hormones in our water, or be they kind of more political or psychological contaminants, such as white supremacy, such as ableism, such as fat phobia, such as heteronormativity. And I'm kind of also interested in the ways that we as Black queer artists, thinkers, fumblers are contaminating these systems, right? And so I'm quite interested in how we're also like infecting and infected, and I'm trying to really move away from these binaries of one or the other, which I think is a very Western way of conceiving the world, and really move towards thinking around entanglement. Plus, I feel like just our relationship is very infectious. So I also want to kind of bring that like joy and fun and energy. Okay. I also love this idea of fumbling in terms of, sorry, just to continue that thought, like sexual fumbling. I also kind of really like fumbling your way through sex, and kind of like, I just like this idea of figuring it out as you go along. feels what's accessible in terms of certainly intellectual thinking, if not sexual thinking at the moment. Okay. So I'm going to read for about 10 minutes. I'm going to share the kind of an excerpt from a piece that was commissioned by the Scottish Bayesian artist Alberta Whittle in 2020 for one of her amazing, gorgeous films. And the piece is called In Search of God, Dirt, or Ecstasy. And it really comes out of a kind of dialogue, again, an infectious dialogue and relationship that I have with Alberta Whittle, who, of course, is also a VED research associate, but also comes out of kind of a moment in 2020 that felt incredibly biblical, I think, in its scope and scale and its sense of transoceanic connectivity. Even though there were many different people living many different 2020s, there was a sense that we were all living through something, particularly those of us who are Black and Afro-diasporic. And so it kind of comes out of this question that's really about faith and about pleasure and about contamination. And it felt like a good piece to kind of read or to share, because I'm really trying to think across timescapes in this speculative provocation, and to think across species, and to think about what it means to put one's body on the line for more than human life, and to be invaded, I suppose, by more than human life for some kind of interspecies liberatory project. So I'm going to read now for about 10 minutes. I'm going to set the timer. And I'm hoping that if you would like to, you can put on captions. Can you show captions? Yes, if you want to show captions, you can show captions. Okay. Although the Thames was muddy, polluted and rich, with feces, old boot leather, distended bodies large and small, mould, moss, silt, feathers, and all other manner of waste in which new life thrived, the vine found its way into the convent. It had come a long way across the Atlantic, adapting to a far from traditional meal of plankton, kelp, and fish droppings, so that the vine that now arose was quite a different being to the one that had departed so many moons ago. It swayed, questing from side to side and up from the sludge of the water to the sludge of the riverbank it coursed, and then cracks of the imperfect wall, and on and up and on, following the feel of faith. It found a damp slit through which light might penetrate like a poker. The vine slunk into her room, keeping to the shadows, undulating in time with the inhalations and exhalations of her fitfully sleeping breath. The stench of devotion was palpable in the air, so thick it could taste her already, and it had been so long since it had dined with a lover. Slowly, but with certainty, savoring every intensification in air density the closer it got to the sleeping woman, whose face was covered with an old dusty Bible, pages fluttering slightly with each breath. Contact, just the slightest hint of a touch, tendril to flesh, ankle already blooming with goosebumps, anticipating the sensations to come. From the rocks, our bodies, and the oceans, and the salts, and the sand, and the seaweed, our hair, and our hands clasped in prayer, and our breasts bare and beckoning for blessings. Forearms caressed in anxious expectation, 1,000 orgasms at our lips, erupting tides from the rivers of our thighs and our fears, bodies turning to rocks, to wood and leaf, pool and crustacean. My sister braids umbilical cords to the next life unbound, and the musk of her sex and her sweat and her menstrual blood fill my amniotic sac, so that I might not forget where I came from, might not forget this is just one life of many, that I might remember I am never alone. The earth split to birth the shoot from nothing but nutrients and intention. Plant life for miles around had strained and strove and labored to birth this one green shoot, one middle finger reaching to the stars, stars where it might one day take root. The shoot came to life hungry for earth and fluids, light and warmth, and it quested about surreptitiously, unsure of predators that might be lurking, but driven out of under by a lust and a thirst for which it could not at first account. It started with invertebrates, agender though not asexual. They sucked and fucked and ate and shat from all orifices top to bottom, and the vine first experienced a joining with slime for lubrication, and more slime ejaculated, and it found it tepid and bland, tenuous and intriguing. The shoot did not reach vinehood until it had experienced complex communion with the densu. After seeking blessings from the river deity Ayensu and experiencing complex communion with the densu. After seeking blessings from the river deity Ayensu and her husband Kwekumoni of the western Simpa Lagoon, the two welcomed the shoot into their riverbed and taught it how to truly pleasure a woman, and thus to truly worship their waters. The vine learned how to travel by water, exchanging nutrients and knowledge from the river weeds, and finally their cousins, the weeds of the sea. At open sea, they invited the vine to join their amorphous, floating cities, rich and packed and peculiar orgies of interspecies ululation and ecstatic conflagrations of mulch. Yet vine had a mission, a message born of blood, an unbearable memory, a knowing that had forced it from thought, from intention, from soil and red dust, a message of knives that contained 1,000 generations of screaming, eclipsed by a single textbook. And once again, the vine hungered. It followed that hunger to a mouth, and upriver to a city, and by night it found a wall, and by morning it feasted anew. The devotee in waiting woke, drenched in her own sin. She had, in fact, climaxed so many times that the mattress was soaked through. She had no memory of what had transpired or from whence the ecstasy had come. She knew only that she had been ravished, had been taken and gifted anew, left open and weeping with strange words on her tongue, a tongue familiar yet unknown, memories her bones had tried so hard to forget. They would say she was a heathen, she panicked, panting and near hysterics. They would say they always knew could not be a holy woman, wholly impure in her manner and her being, her aesthetic, her very skin drenched in blackest sin. Yet she found no culprit in her chambers, nor any evidence of entry. Nothing but a pile of earth upon her crisp white pillow, rich and dark as her fleshful immorality. She whimpered and wept whilst inside her a seed took root, and in her mouth the taste of home. Heads wrapped in iridescent futures we called, our wombs afire with drumming, responding to the call. We ached and bled, and the sinewy life leaked down our calves, muscled and scarred and ancient. It had been generations since we bled, and our Achilles almost forgot the sensation of hot stickiness, of earth and life incarnate kissing the backs of our heels. Not too much now, not too much, save enough for the contouring. Our heads are wrapped in iridescent futures that whip and crack and chatter, catching sun and sea and visions, and our sister quakes in fear, surrounded by white cotton our fingers have known since bud, surrounded by a purity wholly insincere. We call and we quake and we come just a little, so that our lover's seed might set course and bring the message back to us. The vineling trembled a little as it fought gastric acids for survival, as it craved light, air and water and sights to behold, but it knew it had to wait until the waters inside her were echoed by the waters all around. So it sent shocks of Scotch bonnets up her esophagus at regular intervals to spur her onwards towards the ships, to follow blood trails which never dissipate, and dust trails which only sediment and transform, and bone trails who join the clans of the mighty as trophies and totems until they are called home. The devotee booked passage using coins she had repatriated from the prayer box. She knew this mission to be of holy intent, and so left no word of her departure. In the days she was plagued with roiling nausea and vomited frequent prayers into the Atlantic and finally the Sargasso Sea. At night, she was overcome with ecstasies, pungent and all-encompassing. They brooked no argument, and she woke feeling cleansed, light, and malleable, so that whilst her body floated as though with child, it also evanesced a little. And when the ship was caught in storms and thrust deep down to the belly of the swell, she floated a few inches above the deck floor and felt no impact nor any fear. For she knew now her sisters waited, bleeding and coming in perfect synchronicity as she carried the message home. The night the waters turned translucent, and so warm they steamed in the darkness, emitting a throbbing glow that could only mean God was watching, and wished not to miss a moment to shadows. The devotee propelled her body onto the deck, her fingernails broken and bloody from clinging on to bits of splintering ship, for she could no longer walk its halls aground. Rather, she floated, her hair loose and self-assured, swaying only a little in the cross-currents of night air, as though the entire ship had sunk without her notice, and now they swam in place of breathing. The glow of the corals beckoned her topside, and she paid no mind to the night crew, who stared and crossed themselves and crossed their hearts against the Fae and against the message. And the memories their own bodies worked so hard to forget, even as they scrubbed the decks of ships whose conscience could never come clean. She looked into the darkness and saw a tree line beyond human sight, and a beach, and a reef. So she overflowed the bow, and starfish rose to caress her heels and to imbibe the blood and cum that had already started flowing as the drumming rocked her womb, and her breasts grew heavy with potential, and even her buttocks spread invitingly, anticipation leaking just a little. The devotee bit her lip to hold it back and move faster across the waves. Ancestors and descendants alike gathered to greet the new arrival, and they held her as she birthed the vine, and they held each other as it supped and worshipped, and then they held the dirt as it trembled with the message so long awaited. The message of memories, the message of futures, the message of home. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ama. That was quite powerful. Eric, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Dineo. Ama, that was incredible. Yeah, I felt like I was following you on this strange shape-shifting journey with, different configurations of things and persons and elements, and it was a treat to my imagination. Thank you for sharing. I have a PDF. Dineo, if you could kindly help me run it. It's a PDF that shows the trajectory of my photographic practice, starting from 2011 to 2023. But my presentation wouldn't necessarily correspond with the images. I would like to begin by sharing a few stories from when I was a child. Sometime in 1996, perhaps, I lived in a compound house with my family. And within the house was a man who owned a tabletop shop. And so on this tabletop, he would sell sweets. He would also occasionally make photographs. He wasn't a professional photographer, he was an amateur. And so one late afternoon, I remember clearly playing with my little brother when he called us to make a photograph of us. Prior to this, we would typically have photos made of us on special occasions, say on Christmas Day, or on a special Sunday, for instance. And so this moment was quite unique. It was just as kids. There was no adult supervision, and we had complete agency as to how to present ourselves. So immediately he called us to pose. I did not hesitate. I remember my brother standing straight with his arms on his side, and I shook my head. I put one foot in front of the other. I pulled my gray round neck, which was so long, it almost reached my knee. My knees were covered in dust because I had been playing in the dirt. So I pulled my shirt back and I had my two hands on my shoulder. And all I remember from this photograph is the size of my stomach, because the stomach was so big. It took the center of attention of this photograph. But it was a very precious photograph. And it's one of those photos that I remember to date. Beyond the photograph that was made of us, I remember being very fascinated by the camera, by the tool that was used. It was very incredible to my mind then as a child that there existed a machine that could be pointed at the world, and within a few days, reproductions or a likeness of that world could be presented to me on a piece of paper. And so I never forgot that moment. Fast forward sometime in maybe 2001, 2002, I moved into a different part of the town where I lived with my grandma. I was slowly becoming a young man, a teenager, and I became very aware of myself. I became aware of my queerness. I couldn't play football. I couldn't dance well, and I became very self-conscious. And so in one of the rooms in the house where we lived, we had several photo albums. And so I would spend a lot of time with these albums. One of the ways in which I allowed myself to travel or to have fun was also to read books, even though we didn't have many of it in the house. So a very curious incident happened maybe 4 or so years later. I was in boarding school, and when I returned from vacation, I noticed that our albums had disappeared. And so I asked my grandma, and she mentioned that she had to give away, we called it room dividers then. There would be these wooden structures that would house a TV, a stereo, some caps, a different host of items. They were looking to renovating the space, and they had also wanted to replace those structures because they deemed them old. Newer ones were in fashion, glass ones, and so they had given the older ones away, and they contained all of the albums that I had grown up spending so much time with. So this was very devastating for me. Back in school the following term, my brother and I noticed a camera went missing in the room. One of our seniors had brought in a very beautiful Canon camera. It was ultramarine blue and silver. And we had made a few photos, but one of our roommates stole the camera. And so we waited till the senior graduated. And then myself, my brother, and a mutual friend. We marched to the house of the suspected thief, and we told him that the owner of the camera had asked us to come for it. Otherwise, there was going to be a scene in school the following term. And he panicked. He completely panicked. And he gave the camera over to us. And so we went straight to the supermarkets. We bought ourselves some film. We went home, called the neighbors, our friends. We did dress up. We took turns making different photographs of ourselves. The following term, we took the camera back to school because the batch of students within which the owner of the camera had left. But we had an issue. We had no idea how to develop this film. And so we reached out to one of our colleagues who seemed to know everything. And we laid before him our dilemma. And he immediately told us that he knew the perfect way to develop the film. All we had to do was give him some money, give him the film, and then give him a few days, and he would return with our rules completely developed and printed. He completely scammed us. We never received our film. We never received our prints, and the camera got stolen again from us. So this was the second encounter with camera, with photography as I was growing up. The third instance would be when I was in senior secondary school. My little brother got me a camcorder that was completely messed up except for the night vision settings. I think I became very curious about how the camera could see into the night and produce the kinds of images that it produced. So this would also be the third instance. When I finally went to the university, sometime in 2011, I came into contact with photography again. I think I did not know entirely then, but with the benefit of hindsight, I have always felt that it was perhaps the way that images were produced or the way that images came together that fascinated me more than the kinds of images that I would produce themselves, the information within them. I think I know this because of the speed with which I ran through the different genres within photography. I began to think about what it means to produce photography using the lenses of queerness, the lenses of being on the outside, the lenses of being from a working class, the lenses of operating from a place that has a completely different set of philosophical outlook on life, philosophical outlook on image, and what it means to live with other beings or other creations. And so with some of these questions in mind, I began to experiment and began to play with processes, with methods, with chemicals, with anything I could land my hands on in an attempt to see what other pathways, what other photographic histories or trajectories could be forged alongside what we already have. How else could photography be assembled, for instance? Like what could we make it, or what could we program it to do? Could we live inside the photograph? Could we drink a photograph, for instance? Could we make it heal us? What other characteristics of photography exist that can be discovered using these experiences from my life as lenses or as starting points for inquiry. This is what I think has produced the kinds of work that I am interested in, or the kinds of work that I have developed an interest in exploring. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Eric. It was great. I felt like I was walking with you on your journey to discovering and rediscovering your interest in photography. And the anecdotes are really, really, really charming. So thank you for that. I think at this moment, we'll schedule some time for and Eric to kind of share their thoughts between their respective presentations. So who would like to go first?
I would like to. Ama, this was stimulating and challenging to follow through as you read your story. And I immediately think that it is because the usual configuration of images that I am used to conjuring when a story is being told, the tools that I use to follow through a storytelling became suddenly inadequate. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about this relationship between contamination and queerness, because I see the two of them play both in the structure of, maybe not in the structure, but in the content and in the way that you put together the words that are supposed to take us on a journey towards visualizing another kind of world.
Thank you for that beautiful question. Thank you for your just delicious presentation. I always feel like I'm eating at your table, when you speak. I mean, having had the great pleasure of eating at your table, that is also a wonderful experience. But this is like kind of like the best delicacies, kind of eating at your table. You're just like really nourishing my brain, my body, my imagination. It's really wonderful. And also, I've known you a long time and I always learn new things about your life. So I love that as well.
Hey, Mama.
Okay, this is a great question. So I would say a couple of things. One, I think you're right to focus also on structure, because I think there is a real attempt in this text. I didn't read the whole thing. It starts with like a whole page of quotes. And I give a long quote from Saint Teresa of Avalon, who was a saint in, I think, the 1700s, who famously wrote these diaries of like ecstatic encounters that she says she had with God, and like trance like states she went into. And she was a nun. Well, she was a saint eventually, but she was a nun. And then a quote by Vanessa Agard Jones, who is a really incredible Black feminist theorist, from an essay called What the Sands Remember, which is about how sand holds queer memory in Martinique, as well as ecological and colonial memory. And then the third quote is from Octavia Butler about the seeds that will take root in the stars, which I kind of reference in the text. So I think I'm already from the beginning trying to kind of create a pantheon of references, or like a kind of a dictionary, perhaps we might say, of references that are different, that are disruptive, right? Like this is a kind of, in some ways, an odd combination of people to begin this this text with, that then also kind of jumps around in terms of positionality. We have this kind of more than human like position of the vine's perspective, and then there is the devotee in training, the kind of nun in training, and then there are these kinds of ancestral goddess sisters who are also potentially have existed through some form of enslavement or plantation life. And there's this real geographical conversation happening also between the west coast of Africa, between specifically the Thames River in London or in England, and this kind of this Caribbean presence, and the rivers carry this story. So for me, there was a really kind of deliberate intention to disrupt or contaminate linear narrative, and those kinds of, I think, the tools that you say for following or reading, the kind of thing where you go, oh, okay, get it, we're talking about God, we're talking about Christianity, but then we're not talking about God because we're talking about river spirits and we're talking about ancestors. And then, oh, I get it, we're talking about the 18th century, but then are we talking about the 18th century? Because then there are also like plastics in the river. And so this kind of consistent unsettling, which I feel is incredibly like very much how queerness can at its best operate, by unsettling those toolkits that, I think we have been conditioned in. So the text attempts to do that. And then there's also this really visceral, or at least an attempt at a visceral conversation around the contamination, the breaching of the body. This vine kind of arrives and kind of climbs into her room, and kind of like, we don't know what happens, but the vine ends up inside her. So how did it get there? And then she's carrying it, and it's kind of like firing her on with these Scotch bonnets, so then there's this kind of conversation around like agency and, also the weight and, I mean, I always think the word burden is like really inappropriate or inadequate here, but there is something about the weight of ancestry and the weight of the message that I also really wanted to convey here, in terms of the feeling of responsibility of Black liberation, to put it in two words that don't encompass what the message is. Kind of somehow feels too tight for what I mean, but that kind of feeling of being a part of something, and sometimes we're in the current and sometimes we're fighting against the current, but there is a sense of moving, and that is a messy journey, right? Again, it is about the process, it's about the infiltration, it's about being contaminated by histories of colonialism and white supremacy, and also contaminated by our ancestry, also contaminated by ways of being and ways of pleasuring and ways of doing kinship that we don't have language for, but that we have some kind of embodied memory for, something that feels familiar, but that we cannot articulate, which is really at the root, as you know, of a lot of my thinking. So I think all those things are I'm trying to kind of think through in the structure of the text and the language of the text. And this, I mean, I think it's funny, even as I read it, I'm like, wow, this is so explicit, in some ways. So I find that also feels disruptive for me, to be reading this kind of explicit text. And I also really invite, and this is really key to kind of my teaching practice, like lulling one's sense into a space of active but also like passive listening without a need for like complete comprehension. Like you don't need to follow everything word for word. Okay, now we're with the vine. Now we're on the boat. Now the boat is here. You don't need to do the kind of hero's journey linear narrative. You can sit into it, and certain images or words or phrases or ideas might resonate with you in different ways. And that is a totally like valid, generative, useful, valued way of being with a work, which also feels like a kind of queer failure or a queer invitation.
Oh, thank you, Ama.
I know that answers the question.
Oh, I think it does. I think it does. I think for the mere fact that I had to suspend or even temporarily look or search for a means to follow, a means that I would typically not use to follow other texts or other stories that I would hear, that brief moment of suspension and search for another way, for another method, for another means to follow in itself. I think pretty much does something to me as a listener. Probably unlocks something. I know that next time if I am to hear or encounter a story that, that follows this kind of flow that I have already developed a new method, that I didn't have. And I think that in itself is precious. And so thank you.
Thank you. That's such a gift. Okay, so I have a question for you.
It was it that reminded me of Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
There
That
were
sense of like glitching positions. I mean, I was thinking that, like, as I was reading it, because maybe I should have like shared. I wanted you to just listen to it, but if I had shared the screen and you had seen it on the screen, it's also formatted in a really particular way. Like the breathing is scripted in these curved brackets. I can't remember what they're called, those ones that they look like a kissing mouth. So there's this, they're kind of and then there's like asterisks is breaking up the different kind of sections. So there's also maybe a feeling that it's meant to be either performed or read and performed by multiple people. So I think that maybe that's also a different way to think through it living. Anyway.
Yeah, I was asked about that because the way that it is received also then affects our experience of it. And I think that's just as important as the content that we hear, like the experience of it that is created within our physical proximities is really crucial. So I was wondering what forms you've thought of or are experimenting with in terms of disseminating the story.
Yeah.
Like which ones tried out, for instance.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna answer this, then I have a question for you. So so it appeared in Alberta's film in forms of in Reset, her film, in textual fragments. So like particular lines appeared at particular moments. Then we performed the text in London with as a group of 6 Black women. Yeah, there were 6 of us. Then I've been also thinking about doing a kind of a performance, like collaborative, like a performance with a drummer of it. But then it was also printed. So I think I'm definitely interested in these different ways of enlivening or infleshing the text.
Do the audience have copies of the text as you read it? Do they go blank? Like, what are some of the physical
No, never done it where the audience has a copy of it, unless they had, like, I mean, it was printed as part of an anthology, so they could have had the anthology, but it was quite different, disparate from the performance. So yeah, I think also as I kind of engage more in accessible pedagogy, I'm interested in how to make the work, like accessible to as many different kinds of minds as possible, for which reading along can be very helpful. Yeah. Okay, so this is actually my second question, because because you said this really interesting thing. Oh, I love your language. You said, could we live inside a photograph? Could we drink a photograph? could we make it heal us? Okay, and this last point I thought was so interesting, and it speaks to this question that I had written down, since we're talking here about kind of contamination and also learning from not just kind of the more than human, but really like microbial behavior, right? So learning from the way that different kinds of chemical processes collapse ideas around sick and healed, or cured and incurable, or what's the word I'm thinking of, like broken, these kinds of, like, again, like very, very Western post-Enlightenment positions of value, actually, right, of like who and what is valued. And I think microbial and chemical processes really break down that binary, because they're consistently transforming into other forms. So like nematode microbes might eat other microbes, but then they're kind of like, they're not really eating them like we eat them, they're just kind of forming something else, you know? So you said this thing about, can a photograph heal us? And so I wrote down, I've been thinking about the way this kind of increasingly urgent question that, as we know, is really prevalent in Ghana right now and other African countries, around the necessity to heal or fix queerness itself, queerness as a kind of disease or an ailment or an infection of westernization or Western identity. And this propaganda that's being kind of circulated in Ghana and in Uganda and in Egypt, et cetera, at the moment, with particular kind of zest. And so I was wondering how you are thinking through this idea of like healing as some kind of state that is like achieved. I think I'm really kind of interested in troubling this idea of healing, or can we be healed by art? Can we be healed? Is healing the goal? Is, fixing it the goal, whether that's fixing the planet or fixing, whatever are like, sexual kinship models. I think it's a language which can be really wielded violently, I guess is what I'm trying to say, against, in this case, queer Africans or LGBTQ Africans, but also against a whole bunch of other people who suddenly are not like healed enough, or who need to be kind of fixed. So I would just love to hear you talk a bit about how you're thinking through healing, and whether or not your kind of amazing collaboration with the Mampong Aquapem Center for Plant Medicine Research shifted that thinking around healing. I think I wrote down healing, transformation, the medicinal, what the medicinal's for, this kind of train of thought.
No, thank you, Ama. I think I would like to begin by emphasizing, or maybe clarifying, that my turn to plants as a way of looking at photography again was very incidental. I find that within my practice in the last five or so years, I have been interested in photography itself, as beyond the camera, as a program, as an idea that has been embodied and that has found a way to evolve over the almost 2 centuries that it has been legitimized as a specific practice or a specific something. In 2016, when I went about developing the project Just Like Us, which you beautifully honored by participating, I noticed a certain difficulty which I think still persists, and that difficulty was by way of a certain resistance to having images of queerness within the photographic landscape, at least in Ghana. A certain image of queerness, and I think what I did was force through that resistance at the time as a way of perhaps pushing back against the absence or inadequate the inadequate presence of the kinds of images that I thought were necessary as a way of, what's the word? Ensuring that our presence in history is known. But moving on from there, this came about through different encounters, different relationships, and it's like there's a whole network of people and persons and thoughts that have allowed me the privilege to be able to come to this point. But I found that perhaps it wasn't necessarily that one of the other ways that I could think and represent or speak to queerness within photography was to look at the program itself of photography and to look at ways in which I could perhaps deploy queerness as an idea, as a way of being, as a way of moving through the world, and apply that to the program of photography, such that I would look entirely at something else, and by so doing, still bring whatever it is that I find into photography, into our conception of what photography is. And I think that's been the path that I've been on in the last few years. And so, for instance, what does it mean to think about photography, or how would photography look like if it were assembled from a working class perspective, from the perspective of queerness within a tiny village setting, for instance? If there was a woman who found a piece of glass that could instantly capture the world, what would be the process? If not glass, what other material could be used, for instance, to embody the way that photography has come to be? Like, how else could we conceive of it? What other materials could we use to think about it? Are there pathways that could be forged alongside what we have come to accept as photography? Who are the people, the places, the thoughts that are assembling photography again, and what are those kinds of photographies doing beyond representation? How are they still enabling us to think about our world, to record our world, to perhaps preserve it, or maybe not to preserve it? How else are we, or can we put this thing together? And in so doing, how could we bring it into conversation with what already exists, and how can it disturb it? Or how can it contribute to its conversation moving forward? And I think this is the space where I want to operate from. And I think this is ultimately what queerness can afford me. It's already unpopular to be queer, at least where I'm from. It's already what do you call it when something separates you from a larger group?
So
And
already
strange,
segregating or marginalizing or ostracizing.
exactly. It is also ostracizing to live queerly. And so when I go to photography or when I go to materials to work with, it can be funny for me to go to the materials that are certain, to the materials that are established, to the materials that are accepted. The world and the way that I move through it is such that it is unpopular and it is not certain and it is ostracizing. And so I look for tools and I look for similar materials, and I hope that I can bring those in conversation with what is certain in hopes that they can change each other.
I love that. And it makes me think also about the ways that kind of like positioning the medicinal not as something to get you from point A to point B, but it's like you're staying in the fever, right? Like you're staying in the moment of like in the moment of fever, when the medicine meets the virus and a fever ensues and the body is burning, trying to burn the virus, but you're interested in staying in the moment of fever, or photography doing that. I'd love it. Yeah. We can't escape it. Anyway.
No. Speaking of inhabiting fevers, I was also wondering if you could share a little bit on what the process was like inhabiting the being or the consciousness of a vine, for instance. Like, what does it take to be in that place? What kinds of tools do you manufacture for yourself to be able to assume that being? I mean, on the one or on the other hand, I imagine that you are also a vine.
Thank you.
Per the laws of being one in a way.
Yeah.
I would still like for you to reflect on how you get into that place or how you get into that framework.
Yeah, I think this really speaks to this kind of ongoing conversation we've been having. So my first question was going to be about, like, do you consider yourself to be collaborating with the more than human life that the cassava juice that is on the glass plates and the ants that happen to across it? Because we had that wonderful conversation when I interviewed on this for my PhD, where I'm writing about you, as you know. And you said really gorgeously that, it wasn't about collaboration, it was more about contamination or interruption or infection. But maybe that could be what we mean when we say collaboration. And so I think, in the couple of years since I first wrote this piece, I've tried to be incredibly careful with inhabiting or saying that I'm inhabiting like the mind or the character or the position of the more than human. Like that in of itself is like a very anthropocentric thing to do. So I try not to say, oh, I know what the vine feels, So it felt really important for this piece that it is the vine, but it's not a vine that just kind of pops up where any vine is. It's a vine that is born of intention. So it says, we kind of get like a little few sentences of like the origin story of the vine. And it says that like vegetal life for miles around had to like save these enzymes and these different fructose juices and sugars in order to birth this vine out of intention. So there's this kind of queer poly, like baby making, the vineling making that happens from all this vegetal life, because it felt important that I wasn't saying, oh, I, the cactus, or I, the palm tree, feel this, or I, the bird of paradise, but that it was something born of intention for a particular purpose, and or with a particular kind of invocation, or out of a particular kind of ritual. And so as part of that, I had lots of conversations with Alberta, who was on residency in Brazil. So we were thinking about the rivers of the Orinoco, and I was writing about the Densu, and I was thinking about the Volta, and I was thinking about the Thames, and I was thinking about the Mississippi, and these massive rivers that have been so integral that hold so much colonial and ancestral memory, not just of white settlers and occupiers, but also of ancestral deities and indigenous ritualized belief systems. So it was important that I was having this kind of transoceanic conversation. I had also just come home from Ghana, so Ghana was very much in my body at the time of writing, and I tried to write about the vine's encounters with other beings, be they spirit, animal, or human, because I felt that the encounter was something that I could really speak to, the kind of textures and physical or material realities of learning what your body is through having these strange queer sex encounters with invertebrates, like worms and slugs, and then moving on to river deities just to prepare this vine for this journey, with these kind of traveling floating cities that form on the ocean. And then so I think that was where I really tried to sink into the narrative, as opposed to saying, I know what it feels like to be this vine. Yeah. Dineo, I'm looking at you and I feel like we're out of time.
I feel like all of us are privy to a very intimate sharing and exchange of knowledge and experiences between the two of you. I almost feel rude to interrupt.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Akwaaba. You're welcome.
We do have some time left for questions. I'm going to open the floor up to anyone from the virtual audience, from whatever corner of the world you're from, to turn your mic on, turn your camera on if you'd like to, and share any thoughts or questions, comments, contemplations. We'd be very open to hearing. Okay, I'll go first while we wait. So this kind of idea of the word contact and contamination and the different kind of synonyms that work within that, the idea of kinship and skinship, and Eric used the word encounters. Encounters with the divine, or encounters with the ancestors, and how we've kind of very much strongly been using the word contamination. And I wanted to ask, Ama, you've actually also used the word pollination, and how that could also be a point of contact. And I'm mostly referring to your essay, Pollination as Practice, and I'll include the link in the chat, so everyone else can have a look at it and then read through. This kind of engagement of the Anthropocene, and how that is something that we also speak about in bioarts as well. and how the Anthropocene has or the way it's been conceptualized has been criticized for its kind of homogenized worldview and lack of consideration for diverse narratives and experiences. So could you maybe share some thoughts on that and that kind of relationship between contamination versus pollination?
Yeah, totally. Thank you for that gorgeous question. I'll try and keep it brief. I'm just gonna put this clock on so I know what I'm doing. Okay, so I think that contamination in the way that I believe Eric and I are using it, or that we're offering it, or flirting with it, is really disrupting this idea of the Anthropocene, which, as you say, the kind of school of thought that it comes out of is really clumping together. It's really reperforming this universal, post-Enlightenment, human, singular experience, singular way of being in the world, singular way of relating to other beings, and saying, okay, we're now in the age of man, and the age of man, is like what's led us to climate catastrophe. But we're actually not in the age of man, and we have never been in the age of man. We're in the same multi-species messy ages that we've been in, but we're living in a time when the people of a particular lived experience and a particular ideological position have massively dominated and affected the ecological processes of humans, more than human, gases, chemical levels, energy levels all over the planet. There's been this kind of extraordinary mass disruption, which includes the movement of peoples, which includes the genocide of indigenous peoples, which includes forced migration, right? And so I think pollination is very related in that I kind of use this metaphor in this essay, pollination as praxis, to think about the ways that memory and knowledge that has been eclipsed or eradicated by, or attempted eradication by white supremacy and missionary projects and settler colonialism, might be stored in kind of more than human knowledge centers, and how we are not kind of alone in trying to piece back together who we might be in the kind of worlds we might live in the future, if we don't want to follow that anthropocentric singular trajectory where we're all the same. And contamination, I think, is doing this work of really asking us to stay in, I mean, I hate using the Donna Haraway phrase, but to stay in the trouble of the messiness and the complicity, which is much more complicated than, as Stuart Hall called it, the West and the rest, right? It's much more complicated than the global North and the global South, or Euro-America and sub-Saharan continents. We're so entangled up in the complicity of plastic pollution, in the complicity of desiring like mass consumptive futures and extraction and the patriarchy, and we're not all equally implicated in that complicity, but we are tangled up in it. We are ideologically compromised in a way that I think it's really important to sit with. That's a fever that I think it's important to sit with. And the last thing I'm going to say quickly is, I also think it's very problematic to use words like pollination and contamination in this kind of ideological way that I guess I'm doing, when contamination is literally killing off different species, is literally clogging the waterways that whales and fish and plankton are trying to breathe with oil that is spilling out of these tankers, is literally acidifying soil crops, is literally leaking cancer, right? So I think it's also important to keep to not get lost in the kind of unrooted world of, contamination can mean these things, which I think is important, but also to remember that contamination is happening to real living material bodies in really extreme conditions, which are increasingly widespread. So I think we need to hold those together and understand the ways they are entangled.
Thank you for that. I think the word entanglement speaks quite strongly to, I think, the basic human condition that we're all kind of subjected to in our all different various ways. I also wanted to direct a question to Eric, and this is more so around the chemical processes of your photographs, working with these kind of plant-based emulsions. How did you kind of ease into that? Like, can you speak more so towards the kind of concepts of experimentation and play, and how you kind of stumbled or fumbled to that kind of making? Oh, you're muted,
my love.
Eric.
I think in my attempt to, or towards looking for other pathways possible, I had to go back to the beginnings of photography itself. At processes, tests, and different ways of assembling the medium that were discontinued or rejected in favor of others. And I think it's in also partly coming into awareness of the fact that photography was developing at the time, not in isolation to other events that were happening around the world. And so it's coincidence, for instance, with the Industrial Revolution would inform what processes are deemed worth continuing and what processes are deemed worth holding back. And so there was a process from the 1840s that I came across called the anthrotype, and it utilized plant parts. And so one would typically develop the photograph with, say, the pigment or petal or from a tree bark or any part of a plant that had a certain level of photosensitivity that could yield an image. And I imagine that some of these processes were held back because of the sheer amount of time that it took for a photograph to manifest. And so going through some of the archival records on these processes, one learns that it could take as long as 3 weeks sometimes, depending on where one was, in which part of the world, what plant it was, what season, etc. And so I imagine that in the kind of world that was brewing around the 1840s could not have sustained or had no interest in a process like that was slow, that was demanding. And I imagine that such a process could have perhaps been more attractive to a scientist in 1840s in my village, because it perhaps would be more in sync with the way that time is perceived in a place, the way that people in, say, my hometown would conceive of what it means to live with other beings. And so I start from there. I imagine, or I pretend, that such a process was never discontinued. And I began to experiment, to play with different supports, to manipulate it, combine it with other thoughts and other techniques in order to extend it, in almost, in a way, charting a parallel trajectory of photography alongside what we have by continuing a process like this. And so this is how it came about. And I think it's important for some of these failures to be, or rejections to be resuscitated, and to see what else they could give us, or like what other discoveries they could gift us with. And in this case, I am very much interested in what other characteristics of photography have been suppressed for the current characteristics that we all know to take hold. So this is the kind of space where I operate from. I'm still looking to see what else this medium can do and how else it can be assembled.
Thank you. That was really, really insightful. I almost feel like there's still so much more that could be unpacked. I mean, even on the note of exploring queerness in photography, I think that could be a talk on its own as well. Maybe let's shelve that for future conversation with the CMRC. I'm going to open the floor again to anybody else to share their questions and comments. Wait, we have one person here, Molemo. I'm very curious about how you both would think about escapism and the ways in which these forms of practice, this world making and refuge in the possibilities of radical ecologies, enable escapism, particularly against the pain and difficulties of our current moment, the oil spills, the silencing of queerness on the continent, etc. I am often challenged by the Western tradition of envirophilic practices, such as a kind of running away, but also resist the idea that maybe we don't have a right to run, but also don't think this work is running away at all, if there are any thoughts. It's a great point, Molemo. Thank you for that.
It's a great point. Eric, do you want to go first? Or should I jump in?
Yes. I think on my part, I think it would be far from escapism. It's actually very necessary that I already mentioned earlier that if we think about photography, for instance, we are thinking about an idea that has been embodied, that has been assembled, that has been given a form, that we all then use, that we all then go to. And so for me, as all of the things that I described in like before, coming from a working class family, being a queer man, being a Black man, being all of these intersecting identities, it is crucial, it is important that I am able to bring what it means to be those experiences into photography, and not just in the way that I use the tool that already exists, but in the way that I contribute to its conception and the way that where it's headed. And so I don't think about it in terms of escapism at all. If anything, I think there's a death of artists and practitioners from the places that we come from the backgrounds that we come from, who are given the opportunity or who have the environment created for them to participate in the overall program and the overall scheme of things. And it's so important for us to be able to do this, to be able to work on the limits of our practices, to better understand what it is that we are dealing with.
Yeah, I think the question of positionality is so key here, right? And like who feels they have the right to escape, who feels entitled to escape, and also where does responsibility lie? There's a difference between seeking to escape unlivable conditions that have been thrust upon you systemically and generationally, and seeking to escape the consequences of your actions, to put it bluntly. So I think that that's really prevalent. But I also, in the moment of 2020, when a bunch of us here in Europe, and I know in the States as well, you know, Black and Afro-diasporic artists were being kind of commissioned who work in the speculative to write all these other worlds, right? There was this real sense of, oh my God, white institutions, we can't deal with the present. We're suddenly being implicated in this crisis. Oh my God, white supremacy. Oh my God, can you please write us a science fiction world that we can focus on so we don't have to deal with what's happening right now? And I think it was a huge kind of influx of like desperate commissions. And I very quickly started writing against, I mean, to be fair, I don't think I've ever really engaged utopia in any of my speculative writing, but trying to negate the possibility of escape. Because for me, working speculatively and certainly working with pleasure activism, it's about finding ways to stay present, to stay with what's happening without like breaking, because it breaks us, I think, watching the news, what's happening right now in Palestine and occupied territories, what's happening every day to, I mean, the list, right? It breaks us. And so, but we need to stay with it. We need to stay engaged, but also in a way that enables some kind of kintsugi, I think it's called kintsugi, the filling in of gold in the cracks of broken pottery, right? A way that shows the cracks, but enables us to remain somehow functioning. Because we also know that broken people cannot build unbroken worlds. So we have to remain committed to forging something which is not wholly dependent on the violence of the present, while staying with the violence of the present without being broken by it. And I think that for me, the speculative becomes a tool to do that. And I'm interested in how it can be a kind of almost a trickster move of inviting in the white audience who are like, oh great, now I get to sit down and think about, you know, War of the Worlds or A Handmaid's Tale, and then suddenly they're entrapped in the story and they're implicated in the story, and the story is about them and the story is about now. And I think that when it's done well, there may be the kind of facade of escapism that actually really refutes an exit once you are through the door, because a big part of the conversation in the UK right now, for example, is how to get people in the door. And I think that's part of the work that I think the speculative can do, and I think I try to take on.
Thanks for that. That was a great question. Thank you for your insights on that, Ama and Eric. Last call for any questions or comments, contemplations, thoughts, insights, etc., etc., etc.
You can know this conversation between Eric and I will be continuing for many decades to come. I hope. I hope.
All right, I think that's it. I'm not seeing anything else from anyone. So I think, let me just say again, thank you so much to Eric and Ama for presenting and again letting us in on this very intimate conversation. There are many strands we can pull from it. Many thanks to all of you that joined us from various parts of the world through Zoom. Thank you for your engagements. And just to reiterate again, if you're interested in any other programming that VIAD or the CMRC has for the remainder of the year, you can either leave your email address in the chat, or you can email me at dineod@uj.ac.za, and I will manually add you to our mailing list. Alternatively, you can go to our website, which is www.viad.co.za. There is a submission form for our mailing list. You can go on there, as well as peruse our website for any more information on our BioArt program, as well as the program that VIAD has and has had for many years. So I think with that said, I think
Thank you
that's
so much for hosting us so
introduction.
beautifully, Dineo. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. It was such an insightful conversation.
Thank you,
Thank you
Dineo.
so much. Thank you.
As always.
I hope we can meet again and have more intimate conversations.
Maybe in
hopefully-
person.
Maybe in person, and hopefully next time without a time limit.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Eric. Always an absolute pleasure.
It's really lovely sharing with you. Thank you for your friendship.
Thank you for your familyship.
All right. I think that's it for Intra-Actions Part 3. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.